The Palace of Versailles. The palace at Versailles, built for Louis XIV Leroy Saloy, was such an enormous undertaking that it took nearly a century to build. Being the abode of an absolute monarch, Versailles had no equal, although many attempted to emulate it, with Catherine the Great's Winter Palace going some way equal to its regal magnificence. Versailles was originally an hunting lodge. It was extended in classical style by the leading French architect of the day, Louis Lavoie, who began work in 1669. In 1667, Jules Hadar Mansart took over and considerably enlarged the already very large building. Mansart's famous roof was not used at Versailles, but the roof line was strictly horizontal. In keeping with the facade, its windows and classical orders were all kept symmetrical, monotonously so. It must be said, despite the grand sculpture installed on the roof cornice to break up the horizontals. Inside, teams of designers, artists, sculptors, and statists lavished their skills on hundreds of rooms, galleries, and reception halls, of which famous Gallier d'Escaliers, Hall of Mirrors, albeit the most splendid, was but one. The swampy and unpromising countryside surrounding the palace was also turned into an amazingly grand park and gardens by André Lenotre, who also supervised the vast engineering works needed to provide the over 1,000 fountains and other features with water. The Palace of Versailles was the official residence of the kings of France from 1682, when Louis XIV moved his court from Paris, making Versailles the center of power of the ancient regime in France. Jules Houdon Mansart, the king's principal architect, drew the plans to enlarge the palace, removing the terrace that overlooked the gardens to make way for the magnificent Hall of Mirrors. History. The site of the palace was first occupied by a small village and church, surrounded by forests filled with abundant game. It was owned by the Gondi family and the Priory of St. Julien. King Henry IV went hunting there in 1589 and returned in 1604 and 1609, staying in the village inn. His son, the future Louis XIV, came on his own hunting trip there in 1607. After he became king in 1610, Louis XIV returned to the village, bought some land, and in 1623 to 24 built a modest two-story hunting lodge on the site. He was staying there in November 1630 during the event known as the Day of Dupes, when the enemies of the king's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, aided by the king's mother, Marie de Medici, tried to take over the government. The king defeated the plot and sent his mother into exile. After this event, Louis XIII decided to make his hunting lodge at Versailles into a chateau. The king purchased the surrounding territory from the Gondi family and in 1631 to 1634 had the architect Philibert Leroy replace the hunting lodge with chateau of brick and stone with classical pilasters in the Doric style and high slate covered roofs surrounding the courtyard of the original hunting lodge. The gardens and park were also enlarged, laid out by Jacques Boissy and his nephew Jacques de Menon between 1591 to 1637 and reached essentially the size they have today.
Palace of Versailles offers a visual history of French architecture from 17th century to the end of 18th century. It began with original statue with brick and stone and sloping slate mansard roofs of Louis XII style used by architect Philibert Leroy. It then became grander and more monumental, with addition of the colonnades and flat roofs of the new royal apartments of French classical or Louis XIV style, as designed by Louis Leboeuf and later Louis Houdon Mansart. It concluded in lighter and more graceful neoclassical Louis XII style of Petit Trianon, completed by Jean Jacques Dulin in 1768. The palace was largely completed by the death of Louis XII in 1715. The eastern-facing palace has a U-shaped layout with the corps de logis and symmetrical advancing secondary wings terminating with the fort pavilion in the south and the Gabriel pavilion to the north, creating an expansive colony d'honneur known as the Royal Court. Flanking the Royal Court are two enormous asymmetrical wings that result in a facade of 402 meters in length, covered by around a million square feet of roof. The place has 2,143 windows, 1,252 chimneys and 67 staircases. The facade of Louis XIII original statue is preserved on entrance front. built of red brick and cut stone embellishments. The U-shaped layer surrounds a black and white marble courtyard in the center. A three-story avant-garde fronted in eight red marble columns, supporting a gilded wrought iron balcony, is surmounted with a triangle of lead statuary surrounding a large clock, whose hands were upon the death of Louis XIV. The rest of the facade is completed with columns, painted and glided wrought iron balconies, and dozens of stone tables with decorated console holding marble busts of Roman emperors atop the master slate roof and elevated dome windows, a gift led roof designs that were added by Hadrian Mansard in 1679 and 1681. Royal apartments. The construction in 1668 to 1671 Louis enveloped around the outside of Louis XIII's red brick and white stone statue, added state apartments for the king and the queen. The addition was known at the time as Chateau New Chateau. Grand apartments include the Grand Apartment du Roi and the Grand Apartment d'Allery. They occupied the main or the principal floor of the Chateau Neuf, with three rooms in each apartment facing the garden to the west and four facing the garden patio to the north and south respectively. The private apartments of the king and those of the queen remain in the Chateau which elaborate design of the statue apartment followed Italian models of the day, including the placement of apartments of the main floor. The convention of the architect borrowed the Italian palace design. Royal Chapel. The chapel was the last building in the Versailles to be completed during the reign of Louis XIV. It was consecrated in 1710 and was dedicated to Louis IX of France, the ancestor of the patron saint of the king. Construction was begun by Hadrian Mansard in 1699 and was completed by the court. Daily services, wedding ceremonies, and baptisms were held in this chapel until 1789. Like other royal chapels, it had two levels. The king and the family worshipped in the lower gallery on the upper level, while ordinary courtiers stood on the ground level. Royal Opera. The Royal Opera of Versailles was originally commissioned by Louis XIV in 1682 and was built at the end of the north wing with a design by Mansart and Bigarani. However, due to the expense of the king's controversial wars, the project was put aside. The idea was revived by King Louis VII with a new design with engaged decorating capability in 1748. This also was temporarily put aside. As you can see, gardens and fountains in the Palace of Versailles and the groves. The largest part of the garden is divided into geometric baskets, compartment-like grooves, 8 on the north side of the garden and 6 to the south. They were bordered with high trees and carefully trimmed in cubic forms to resemble rooms, the walls of greenery. Each basket had its own theme and fountains. Statuary, grottos, and other decorations, some were highly formal, and Hadrian Mansard baskets lined colonnade with a circle of columns alternating the fountains, while others imitated nature.